For 2 millennia, the accepted account of the Etruscans came from Greek and Roman writers. Greek authors placed their origins on the shores of Anatolia, describing a people driven from their homeland by disaster and forced to cross the Mediterranean in search of new soil. Roman historians largely accepted this tale, folding it into their own foundational myths. Then, in 2021, that story collapsed. A team of geneticists sequenced DNA from 82 individuals who had lived across 2,000 years of Italian history. And the results didn't just question the old narrative, they dismantled it entirely. The Etruscans, it turns out, never migrated from anywhere. They were native to Italy from the start. What happened to them centuries later after Rome absorbed their territory is a far stranger and more troubling tale than any migration myth could offer. The ancient sources we've long treated as authoritative built their entire framework on one premise, that the Etruscans arrived from elsewhere, bringing exotic customs, an unfamiliar tongue, and a level of sophistication that made them seem almost otherworldly to their neighbors. Herodotus claimed they fled famine in Lydia. Hellanicus of Lesbos echoed the idea. Other early writers speculated about Greek roots or vague Eastern connections. This account went unchallenged for 2,000 years, simply because no one had the means to test it. And it wasn't just accepted passively. Entire chapters of Roman self-understanding were constructed on top of it. Rome's early kings were said to be Etruscan. The augurs, the religious officials who read omens for the Roman state, practiced a divination system supposedly imported from Anatolia. Generations of students learned this as fact, but the writers we cite, Herodotus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, were composing their accounts long after Etruscan civilization had already faded. They were working from secondhand knowledge, geographic assumption, and cultural bias, not direct observation. In 2021, an international team spanning the Max Planck Institute, the University of Tübingen, the University of Florence, and partner institutions in the US, Denmark, and the UK sequenced complete genomes from 82 people who lived across central and southern Italy between roughly 800 BCE and 1000 CE. Their findings appeared in Science Advances. The verdict: there was no trace of Anatolian ancestry entering the Etruscan population around the time of the supposed migration. None. If a substantial group had arrived from Lydia near 1200 BCE, it would have left a clear genetic footprint. Instead, Etruscan ancestry traced to the same 3 deep layers found throughout Iron Age Italy, early Neolithic farmers whose Anatolian roots ironically went back thousands of years earlier and were long since blended into the local population. Bronze Age steppe herders tied to the spread of Indo-European peoples and the original hunter-gatherers who had lived on the peninsula since the Ice Age. Genetically, the Etruscans were indistinguishable from the Latins living just 30 miles away. Their singular undeciphered non-Indo-European language and their striking cultural output weren't imported. They grew from a population that had been rooted in the same soil for millennia. If the Etruscans were simply local, how did their language, so unlike anything else in the region, survive the wave of Indo-European speakers spreading across Bronze Age Italy? The genetic evidence points toward a long process of blending in which incoming Italic speaking groups were gradually absorbed into an established Etruscan-speaking community, rather than the reverse. That the language endured for so long, surviving well into the Roman era before Latin finally overtook it, suggests a society with deep internal cohesion, one strong enough to absorb newcomers without losing its own identity. That's not the profile of a young population of arrivals. It's the profile of an entrenched civilization holding its ground. For roughly 800 years through the Iron Age and into the early Roman Republic, the Etruscan gene pool stayed remarkably consistent. A trickle of outsiders from Central Europe, North Africa, and the Near East showed up occasionally, but they were exceptions rather than the rule. Despite the political chaos swirling around them, Rome's rise, Greek colonization, expanding trade, the underlying Etruscan population held steady. That changed abruptly once Rome became a Mediterranean empire. Beginning around 27 BCE, with Augustus's rise and continuing for roughly 5 centuries, the genetic makeup of central Italy shifted dramatically. Not across generations of slow blending, but in what researchers describe as a rapid, sweeping reorganization. Roughly half of the region's ancestry came to be traced to Eastern Mediterranean sources. Tübingen researcher Cosimo Post, one of the study's lead scientists, attributed the bulk of this shift to enslaved people brought into Italy, along with soldiers and merchants moving through the expanding empire. In other words, Rome wasn't only administering conquered Etruria, it was relocating vast numbers of people from the Levant, Egypt, Syria, and North Africa into the Italian heartland. Enslaved laborers worked the great estates, military units from the provinces were garrisoned nearby, traders moved along imperial routes, Whether through intermarriage or coercion, these populations merged with the descendants of the old Etruscans, and within a handful of generations, the biological composition of the region was transformed. Consider what that means. After 8 centuries of maintaining a distinct language, religious tradition, and artistic identity, even shaping Roman religion and aesthetics along the way, the Etruscan descended population was fundamentally altered within a few generations of imperial rule. The people occupying the same towns and inheriting the same customs their Iron Age ancestors had were by around 100 CE a genetically different group. Rome didn't merely conquer the Etruscans. Politically, it dissolved them demographically, not through outright extermination, but through the deliberate larger-scale movement of foreign populations into their territory. The medieval period added further layers. Germanic ancestry arrived as Rome's administrative structures broke down and migrating peoples moved into former imperial lands. Today's Central Italian gene pool reflects all of it. Ice Age, hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age, steppe migrants, the Roman era influx from the Eastern Mediterranean medieval Germanic arrivals, and countless smaller contributions, since, as a distinct genetic population, the Etruscans didn't survive this, not suddenly, but definitively. Yet something of the Etruscans persisted through the very people who displaced them. Rome adopted Etruscan religious customs. Its augurs used divination methods derived from Etruscan priests. The fasces, the bundled rods symbolizing state power, came from Etruria. Even the toga has Etruscan roots. Rome absorbed the Etruscans biologically while simultaneously becoming a custodian of their culture. This is the paradox at the center of the story. A population can transmit its language, beliefs, and traditions to descendants who are in genetic terms no longer primarily descended from them. Culture and biology don't travel on the same track. A resident of Roman-era Tuscany could have carried mostly Eastern Mediterranean ancestry while still practicing rites that were unmistakably Etruscan on land that had always been Etruscan regional continuity, and population-level genetic continuity are two separate things. And this case shows just how far apart they can drift. After that imperial-era upheaval, the genetic makeup of central Italy settled into something closer to what we see today. The populations of Tuscany, Lazio, and Basilicata show continuity from the post-imperial period onward. This means the genetic foundation of most modern Central Italians took shape somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, following a period of dramatic change, and has remained fairly stable since. What made this study possible was its extraordinary time depth, 2,000 years of samples. Let researchers trace not just a single moment, but an entire arc, centuries of Iron Age stability, a sharp imperial era rupture, and a subsequent medieval settling into a new genetic baseline. This is an inference from indirect evidence. It's a direct molecular reading of ancient skeletal remains. The wider lesson here goes beyond the Etruscans themselves. This research shows how genetic evidence can outright disprove long-accepted historical narratives, and how much caution is warranted when textual sources are our only window into questions of origin and population movement. The classical writers weren't being deceptive. They were working with limited geographic knowledge and reasonable-sounding assumptions that happened to be wrong. We simply had no way to check their claims until now. The real story of the Etruscans isn't one of mysterious foreign settlers bringing civilization to Italy. It's the story of an indigenous population that built a distinctive culture, held onto its language against the tide of Indo-European expansion, and then had its biological identity overwritten by the demographic machinery of Roman imperialism, all while its cultural fingerprints lived on in the people who replaced it. It's a reminder that labels like Etruscan Latin or Roman don't map cleanly onto biology. A 3rd century inhabitant of Etruria might have carried mostly Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, while still practicing Etruscan religious rites in ancestral Etruscan land. Genetics gives us precision, but not the whole picture. Identity is always more tangled than any single lens can capture. One puzzle remains, even after all this. If the Etruscans really were local all along with no dramatic founding migration, how did a language so unlike its neighbors take hold and endure in a region increasingly dominated by Indo-European speech? The DNA confirms that it happened, but doesn't fully explain the mechanism. That piece of the puzzle still rests on a combination of archaeology, linguistics, and inference. Perhaps that's fitting for a civilization that has puzzled scholars for 25 centuries. And it raises an uncomfortable question for how we think about heritage more broadly. Does a modern Tuscan who has inherited Etruscan customs through unbroken regional presence, but carries very little direct Etruscan ancestry count, as less connected to that past than someone elsewhere who happens to carry a larger share of Iron Age Italian DNA, cultural identity, genetic ancestry, and territorial continuity, don't always align. And the Etruscans are a vivid case study in just how far they can pull apart. What's most striking is how this evidence both undercuts and validates classical historiography at once. The ancient writers were wrong about where the Etruscans came from, but right that they were culturally distinctive, linguistically unique, and deeply influential on Rome. The error was about origins. The observation about character was sound. That suggests genetics and textual history aren't competitors, they're complements. Genetic data alone can't explain cultural change, and texts alone can't confirm population movements. Together, they offer something closer to the truth. For 2,000 years, we took Herodotus and Dionysius at their word, because we had no way to test their claims. The fact that modern genetics can now overturn a core piece of their account should make us cautious about how much weight we place on inherited authority and curious about how many other long-settled historical stories might be resting on similarly untested ground, waiting for the right bones to be found and the right questions to be asked.